Before we're done, I'd like to talk about supertypes and subtypes. And I've segregated this here at the end for a couple of reasons. One is that the use of supertypes and subtypes in conceptual data models is is fairly recent. Okay, so conceptual data models using ERDs have been around since before 1980. Professor Chen invented the approach in a paper that he published in 1976. Okay, so that's been around 45 years now. Okay, and when it was developed, it didn't include support for um, uh, super entities and sub entities. Okay. Now, somewhere along the way, uh, people got interested in the super entities and sub entities, and so the topic has come up. Okay. Why are they so interested in? Oh, it probably has to do with the advent of object-oriented programming technologies. So, object-oriented programming languages support the concept of uh, supertypes and subtypes um, uh, of classes, and classes involve both data and behavior. Okay, and there are times when the people who are using object-oriented programming languages would like to be able to map these internal supertypes and subtypes, which are typically superclasses and subclasses in the programming language. They would like to map them directly to things in the data store. Okay, and so thus arrived the motivation for supertypes and subtypes. Now, a couple reasons why I haven't historically included these coverage of these in my course. One is I think the use of supertypes and subtypes in data models is not a beginner skill. Okay, and then two, most of my students are going to be implementing their data models in relational databases, and relational databases do not support super entities and sub entities directly. Okay, so having warned you off of this, I do think that this is an intermediate skill. I do think that quite a few people have an interest in trying to think of their data models in terms of super entities and sub entities. And so I've included this here for them um, with the warning, which you've already heard. So let's talk about some of the basics, okay? So, um, with respect to entity relationship diagrams as a way to describe um, uh, entities and relationships and attributes, right? Um, the supertype and subtype features have been introduced to entities. So we have super entities and sub entities. Okay. You couldn't draw those in the original ERD, entity relationship diagrams. So around the time where they brought this concept in, we brought in these things called EERDs, extended entity relationship diagrams, and those support super entity types and sub entity types. So starting here, some of the ERDs that I'm going to be shown are more accurately EERDs, extended entity relationship diagrams, but people call them all ERDs, so I'm going to do that as well. So with respect to entities, if you have supertypes and subtypes of entities, they form a hierarchy. Okay, so and a test that we have for them is we say that a subtype is a kind of supertype. So let's look at a diagram. Okay, so this is a hierarchy diagram. It's not an ERD or EERD. It's just a way of kind of understanding how superentities and subentities would work. Okay, so typically when we diagram them, we put the superentity on top and the subentities on the bottom. Okay, so we're saying that bank account would be a superentity, and there would be three subentities: checking account, savings account, certificate of deposit account, okay, and that they would all have to pass an is a kind of test. So checking account is a kind of bank account. Savings account is a kind of bank account. Certificate of deposit account is a kind of bank account. If you can't pass an is a kind of test, then you don't have a proper subentity. Okay, so checking accounts are bank accounts. Savings accounts are bank accounts. Right? Now, I talk about this as an is a kind of test. Okay, practitioners in the field and a lot of books will tell you that this is an is a test. This is another case in which you're not speaking carefully enough. Again, groups of professionals kind of get shop talk, and in shop talk, checking account has to pass an is a test. But if you want to be more thoughtful and more accurate, it has to pass an is a kind of test. Another concept that's important for superentities and subentities is the issue of whether or not a particular instance can be more than one of the subtypes. So if it could be more than one of the subtypes, we call those overlapping subtypes. If they can only be one and only one of the subtypes, we call that disjoint. Okay. Now it turns out that overlapping subtypes are very impractical. So if you're going to have a supertype subtype design that has a chance of not being a train wreck, these should be disjoint. So every bank account should be either a checking account or a savings account or a certificate of a deposit account. That's your classic disjoint super sub design. Okay. I mentioned already that practitioners, even though I say it's is a kind of test, practitioners in the field will often say it's an is a test. It's just their uncareful way of speaking. Okay. Now, here's the thing to think about. Despite their superhero names, supertypes are less powerful than subtypes. Well, how so? Okay. Well, it turns out that subtypes inherit all of the attributes and the relationships from their supertypes. So they have all the capabilities that the supertypes have, plus they can have their own individual attributes, and they can also have their own relationships Okay, so who's the more powerful? Is it the super that only has the common stuff, or is it the sub who inherits all the common stuff plus has its own capabilities as well? Well, it's definitely the subs. Although, by the way, um, you know, if you're using the word super in the sense of superhero, you would think the superhero could do, do things that no ordinary people could do. Okay, but it's actually the subtypes that are the more powerful. Okay, and I already mentioned disjoint rather than overlapping. But trying to design super entities and sub entities that are overlapping is just, it's a bloodbath. Not to be done. Okay, more about supertypes and subtypes. Um, so both super entities and sub entity types are shown on the extended entity relationship diagram, or EERD. We're just going to call them ERDs from now. In my course, we use a notation that connects the entities with lines and a special symbol. So there's a couple of ways to diagram this. I pick one that's most friendly towards Lucidchart. Okay, so that's what we're going to use. Okay, so in this diagram, which I'll make a little bigger so you can read, uh, customer is the super entity, and individual customer and corporate customer are the sub entity. And this example is from the Andy Oppel book, but I've kind of amped it up. So anything that's good here is Andy Oppel's. Anything that's wrong, I'll take the blame. I'll take the blame for. Right. So customer is the super. The subs are individual customer and corporate customer. And how do you know? Well, they're connected by these solid lines, and a symbol, the symbol that I chose, was the circle. Okay. And how do you know what's the super? Well, if you can draw them so that the super is on top, that's a good idea. Okay. And you can usually tell from the naming. All right. All right. Now, here are the kind of inheritance features. Okay. The attributes of customer get inherited by individual customer and corporate customer. Okay. Also, the relationships. So the relationship of customer, I'm sorry, the has a contact relationship between customer and customer contact is inherited by individual customer and corporate customer. Okay, that's why individual customer and corporate customer have more power. They're more powerful than customer, because they have all the capabilities of customer, plus they have their own attributes, and corporate customer has its own relationship, has corp type to corporation type. Okay, so that's how we would draw this. Okay, and this is this is sort of a typical super type subtype design for a conceptual data model. Okay. So the supertype carries the common attributes and relationships. Each subtype carries the attributes and relationships that apply only to the subtype. But the ones from the super are implicitly part of the subs. Okay. Typically, in this kind of design, um, all of these types share the same unique identifier. In this case, it would be customer ID. Well, let's just go back and look and see if that was the case. Yeah, all three of them have got customer ID. Okay. All right. Now, when to use supertypes and subtypes? Well, I'm going to go ahead and say that supertypes and subtypes should be used very sparingly. Okay. Um, uh, I think that they're overused. Okay. Um, it turns out one of the last things that I'm going to say here, I'm not going to say last, I'm going to say it now, is because the SQL standard has no support for entity type hierarchies. Now, there are relational databases that are SQL based that have their own proprietary super entity and sub entity support. Okay, but there's no one way to do it. Okay, so if you adopt those super entity sub entity features, if you're going to implement your data store using relational databases, then you're locked into that vendor. Okay, if you want to move to another relational database vendor, well, then you're going to have a big conversion on your hand. And some of the vendors don't even have these kind of features. All right. So use them very sparingly because you're not going to get a lot of support if you're going to implement your data store with relational databases. Um, I tend to find that beginners are way too eager to use these type hierarchies. They see them, once you've heard about a type hierarchy, you see them everywhere. Okay? Now, when should you use them? Okay, I've kind of warned you off using them. What are the indicators that it's a good idea to use them? Well, the design we just saw is, I think, got the indicators. Okay, there are common relationships. Okay, and distinct relationships. And then there are common attributes and there are distinct attributes. Okay. If you don't have any distinct attributes or you don't have any distinct relationships, well, then you have no case for super type, super entities and sub entities. Okay. Uh, you need these features to drive the decision. All right. Now, another consideration is that only type hierarchies where the subtype of an instance will persist indefinitely are practical. Okay. When we were looking back here at the individual customer and the corporate customer, this would not work on a practical basis if somebody was an individual customer for a while, then they became a corporate customer, then they would go back to being an individual customer. These design features only work if it's the nature of things that an instance is going to be an individual customer and will stay that way forever. There'll be a corporate customer and they'll stay that way forever. What if situations change in the business? Well, then it's a new customer. That's the only way to deal with it. These type characteristics have to persist indefinitely. Okay. Um, In most cases, you can do just as well or better by using not thinking about types and subtypes at all. And now I'm going to show you something where a lot of people uh, want to use the type and subtype, and we talk them out of it. Okay? So here's the situation. We've got a person and their occupation. Okay. Now, here's what people have just learned about types and subtypes with entities want to do. We say, okay, we've got people and their occupations, and so they start thinking, okay, I'm gonna have a person type. Okay, and then my subtypes are going to be lawyer and doctor and tribal leader. Okay. And then they start thinking, well, what's going to be, I'll probably want to know some things about a lawyer, then I'm not going to want to know about a doctor, and I'm not going to want to know about a tribal leader, and then they'll get really excited. Well, the problem is that these designations don't persist indefinitely. Okay. In fact, and on top of that, they're not disjoint, right? So it's possible for one person, Mary, to be a lawyer, and you get kind of bored with that, and then to go, to medical school, and then to become a doctor, okay, and then uh, she's highly respected in her tribe, and eventually she retires as a doctor and becomes a tribal leader. Okay. It's also possible for um, another person um, to be the same thing at the same time. Uh, Maybe they're practicing as a lawyer and they're practicing as a doctor because they're doing, oh, some kind of legal aspects of cutting edge medicine. And this whole time they've been a tribal leader. Okay. So this subtype distinction falls apart. It can't be a disjoint. The identities as being a part of a subtype don't persist indefinitely. It's a mess. What about if you turn around and you model it as a relationship, a binary relationship between a person and an occupation? Okay. And you could say the person is employed as the occupation. Okay. And a person could be employed as a lawyer, a doctor, a tribal leader. Well, what if we want to know what they're primarily doing at any one time? Well, we could decide to carry data on the relationship, so we could represent this as an associative entity, and we could carry start date and end date. We could do something like that. So even though a lot of people get excited about a lot of these things, where we could model them as supertypes and subtypes, the fact is that many things, many things, are better modeled as the person is playing some kind of a role, you know, uh, you know, occupation, any kind of thing like that. Okay, so that uh, I'm warning you off supertypes and subtypes. I want you to know what they are. I want you to be ready to use them when the time comes that you want to try to use them. But at the same time, I want you to know that usually the best design looks more like the design on the top and not like the design on the bottom. Okay? And again, I'm going to say beware if you're implementing your data store, if your conceptual data model is going to be implemented with a relational database, uh, most relational databases don't have support for superentities and subentities. And so that when you get to really implementing this, you're not going to have that feature anyway. Okay? So I'm hoping that this discussion puts you as the beginner in the position that you know what supertypes and subtypes are. You maybe have some ideas about when you might want to use them. You have some idea about what alternative designs are that might be more appropriate than supertypes and subtypes, and that you consider yourself forewarned that you might not be able to implement all the features if you use them, depending upon what product you use to implement the data store. And that's going to be it for supertypes and subtypes. I'll say bye until next time. Bye bye.